Rulership is another important concept when studying China because the rulers, in a sense, define, right, what happens in China and what kind of art can be made. Now, a little bit on terms before we start looking at specific monuments and specific rulers, is the term Tian or heaven. And Chinese believe that Tian, or the heavens, right, granted rulership. Here you're looking, of course, at the famous Tianten, or the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. If you've ever been to Disney World and gone to Epcot, right, you might have also seen this building, the replica of Tianten there. But this is the idea that the heavens grant rulership, that the heavens smile upon the ruler. And this is something you see throughout rulership across the globe, right? This sense of a heavenly hand, perhaps, in the selection of rulers. And Chinese had emperors that ruled in dynasties. And typically the dynasties are given titles in order to define them. So the idea of like the Shang, for instance, even though that was really, somewhat towards the beginning of rulership in China, or looking later, the Qing, let's say. And many of the names of the dynasties have meaning. So for instance, the Qing, right, meant clear or pure. The Ming dynasty, Ming, meant bright or brilliant. So many of the names of the dynasties held meaning. Notice that these are not family names that are used for the dynasties, are more descriptional markers, we might say. And another reason I wanted to bring that up is because the Chinese rulers really wanted to define themselves. So when the Qing dynasty names themselves, they're trying to say they are pure people. Um, Emperors actually would change their names often during their reign to recommunicate something to the people that, how they felt about themselves as a ruler had changed. So I remember being in China and we went to this one monument where it was basically like 5 or 6 different emperors were buried there. And when you saw their gravestones, right, their stelae outside of their tombs, I don't read Chinese, but our guide was saying that often there would be 5 or 6 different names on these monuments because they had changed their name multiple times during their rulership to reflect different attitudes of their rule. So this idea of naming yourself and having the name have value, I think, is really important when you think about Chinese rulership. Of course, we're going to start out looking at one of the most famous rulers, the Emperor Qin, whose name, of course, goes on to label China. And Qin is fascinating because he's one of the earliest rulers. Many people talk about him as the first emperor. And basically, he is notorious for this sort of legacy of control. That before he ruled, there was a lot more flexibility, right, in what could be done in as far as leadership was concerned. But he basically just threw all the old rules out and created this new legacy that others had to follow. So it granted him, you know, a lot of respect, but also a lot of people disliked him at the same time. So when we're looking at his tomb, you have to think about the fact that this was a man who was larger than life, but also was probably highly paranoid because a lot of people didn't like the fact that he changed how everything had been done. For instance, one of the things that he changed was, how people got their positions. Confucianism before this suggested that, of course, your status and your hierarchy, sort of got you what you got. And so, if you were of a certain family within Confucian thought, that meant that you were able to gain certain positions. Qin didn't like the idea that birth could determine what you got, not merit. So he basically actually banned and banished and killed all the Confucian scholars. I said that, Confucianism, a lot of what we know about it, we have to understand that there's this kind of gap that occurs because of Qin's decision regarding Confucianism. But he wanted merit to mean more than status or birth. And then he really wanted to systematize everything from money to language to pretty much everything. Chinese, as we know it today, was because Qin basically said, we can't have all these different dialects being spoken. Before Qin's time, we call it the time of the warring states, right? And there were like loose areas of governing, and all kinds of different dialects being spoken all over the place, all different kinds of money being used. And he was like, this is madness. We need to have a system. And so Chinese as we know it today was because Qin went through and said, we're going to systematize the dialect down to one type, which is really pretty much contemporary Mandarin. And we're going to have that be the official spoken language. This is why sometimes you meet Chinese who they can speak different dialects of types of Chinese because they know they have to speak Mandarin as an official language, let's say. But the polyglot from their region, the tonal type from their region is quite different. But Qin said, if everybody's on the same page, then everyone will understand. If we're using the same money, everybody can trade. And you might say, why talk about wagon wheels? He thought about the idea that if people had different widths of wagons and different types of wagon wheels, that all the ruts in the road were different. So people were kind of bouncing in and out of the ruts. And he said if everyone had the same type of wagon wheels and the same type of circumference and same wagon style, then everybody would have the same ruts in the road and everyone would go smoothly along. So he would argue he's trying to smooth out the road for everybody through these changes. But again, he did so in a way that many felt was very strict or controlling and didn't allow for a lot of difference to flourish. So, it depends on how you look at Qin, I think, how you read him as a leader. You either read him as someone who sort of smoothed out the road for all, or you read him as someone who didn't like diversity, it didn't like difference, and would erase it if he felt that made things easier for everybody. So he's a complicated leader, to say the least. And I mentioned that, he probably had a little bit of paranoia about people not liking him for certain, decisions that he made. This is his famous tomb at Xi'an. When I was in China, this is one of the locations that we got to visit. And the reason you don't see any of my personal photos here is because you're not allowed to take pictures inside the tomb. Only official portraitists and photographers are allowed to work inside the complex. So basically you can use these stock photos. That's about all that's available to you. The complex is like multiple football fields long. It's huge and is made up of the basically the soldiers or the army of Qin, these terracotta soldiers that were meant to protect his tomb. Now, to be clear, the tomb of Qin is in a different location. So like where his body is buried is in a different location. And they've not yet technically completely found it. They've found evidence that they might be getting close, but what we have right now is this area of his tomb, which is the protective force that was meant to, keep him safe in the afterlife. There's a little bit of hearkening back, you'll think, to Egypt here as well. So a lot of times when we talk about these tombs, they have a little bit of a similarity to Egyptian beliefs of the afterlife and sort of protection in the afterlife. But this is his army that we believe was put into place, right, to protect him. He also, of course, planned for all the things he'd need in the afterlife. So he put stocks of animals in place. You'll see on the right, there's like these little pigs and different things that, was probably meant to be like his food supply in the afterlife. So he prepared on all levels, from protection to necessities, on down. And again, there's just rows and rows and rows, right, of these soldiers and these, necessities that he had laid in. The material that's used here is terracotta or clay. Terracotta, literally in Italian, is like terra, earth, cotta, clay. It's like clay of the earth. So that was material that was used. It's highly breakable, but we know that this site was undisturbed because you'll note that most of the terracotta soldiers are in great shape as the archaeologists are unearthing them. At last count, there were around 8,000 soldiers that I heard were accounted for here. Around that estimated, right? So a lot of them. And one of the things that's especially interesting about them is that they're all individualized. They have different types of hairstyles, different ethnic features. So even though Qin, in a sense, wanted to systematize a lot of things, what I did think was interesting here at his tomb is he did have the facial features reflect the different ethnic groups of China in the diversity of China. So He's a complicated guy, right, as far as his background and his attitudes were concerned. But there is this uniqueness of each of the soldiers. Some of the soldiers you'll notice are like hand-to-hand combat soldiers, like the one on the left. Some are archers, like you see on the right. He's sort of bowed in the pose of holding a bow in his hand, and then he's about to shoot an arrow maybe, or get ready to shoot an arrow. So there's all kinds of different types of soldiers that were basically part of, what was being created to protect him right here at the tomb. So there's a big diversity of different types of soldier types as well as the look, right, of the soldier. And we think that this was supposed to be, in a sense, not just protection for Qin, but also happiness for him in his afterlife. That he would have these chariots to ride around in. He could have a barbecue pig feast one day, right? That he had everything he needed to be safe, protected, and happy into his afterlife. So again, this is why I would sort of compare it a little bit to Egypt. What he's doing here, the inflection or the feeling to me is a lot the same about what Qin was preparing here as far as the afterlife was concerned. His actual tomb, where his body was buried, is rumored through the writings we have to have had rivers made of mercury that would mimic like the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers, which were the lifeblood rivers of China. And again, if you think about every culture, like I said with India, right, the Indus River was like their lifeblood. The Yellow and the Yangtze River for the Chinese were their lifeblood rivers. So in his tomb, it was said that there would be like a map of China on the floor that sort of looked like the geography of China, and these rivers of mercury that would look like the Yellow and the Yangtze River. And then on the ceiling, it was said that there would be like inlaid gems and different things that like mimic the idea of the constellations in the sky. So no holds barred, right, for Qin. Again, they're still looking for this tomb and hoping that they'll find it eventually so they can excavate it. Another interesting thing about mercury is that Qin and other leaders around his time actually thought taking mercury pills was good for you. So just like the Shang leaders, probably bad medical advice there, right, at the end of the day. The other famous Qin monument, of course, is the Great Wall of China. And the Great Wall of China, right, is probably the most notable monument in China. It was originally meant to be a protective barrier between the Mongolians to the north and the Chinese to the south. It's unique in that it follows the geography of the landscape. So when I was there, one of the things we got to do was go visit the Great Wall of China. And I loved taking these pictures that really showed you how dramatic the sort of elevation shifts would be as the wall just sort of went over and around the landscape. They moved troops on here on the wall, and also horses and such. So it's really interesting to think of troops like marching up and down these different segments of the wall that are quite hard to traverse, right, in places. So again, this idea of using it, right, just running right across the landscape with it. There's this idea of Chinese culture sort of celebrating dragons. You see dragons used a lot in their mythology. One of their astrological year signs is the dragon. I'm a proud dragon. And many people talk about how the wall was meant to look like a sleeping dragon, kind of laid out, right, as if it's sleeping on top of the mountainsides. I went to the section of the wall called the battling section, and it's not that far outside of Beijing, and of course is very mountainous like you see here, but other sections are in the middle of desert, all kinds of different geographies. Some parts of the wall completely disappear right into the landscape, then reappear. The battling section I saw, of course, it's maintained for tourists, so it's in very, very good shape. But again, you can go out into the countryside and find parts of the wall that have been completely abandoned and have fallen apart. But I think the wall also speaks to Qin's beliefs about protection, just like his tomb did, where, in a sense, he's creating this monument of protection. It speaks to his values of sort of being a little bit paranoid, right, about everybody around him.